Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Allison Jessing. I'm the head of adult curriculum at Howard County Library System. At Howard County Library System, we condemn racism, xenophobia, misogyny, hatred, racial and gendered violence, and discrimination of all forms against all people. We believe in standing against hatred each time as it is in our midst and strategizing and enacting change. We truly believe that lasting change requires true and lasting intention to learn, grow, and act. Learning from the history of Anne Frank's life and her legacy and the tragedy of her fate is part of this learning process. That is why we have launched a new initiative called Brave Voices, Brave Choices, and included this event as part of that series of learning opportunities. I'm going to share a link in the chat, and I will also include that in the email I send tomorrow with more information on our new Brave Voices, Brave Choices initiative. Now it's my great honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Gillian Perry. Since her retirement as executive director, as well as co-founder of the Anne Frank Trust UK, Ms. Perry has been lecturing and speaking in the UK and the USA, as well as on international cruise ships. She is a hugely popular speaker and has had many years speaking, lecturing, and broadcasting experience all around the world. She has been privileged to meet many people who knew Anne Frank and shared their personal recollections with her. In 2010, she was awarded an MBE for services to education, and in 2018, she published her first book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, available to borrow, as I mentioned, from the library or wherever books are sold, including our local bookstore partner, Books with a Past. I'm going to place a link to her website in the chat as well, and I'll include that in that follow-up email I sent to you tomorrow. Ms. Perry, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ali. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you from London. It's been a bit of a cold and rainy and windy day today, so I hope the weather over in Howard County in Maryland is a bit better and a bit more spring-like. So before I actually speak any further, I'm just going to share my screen so you can all see the presentation. And hopefully, if it's all worked correctly, you will have on your screens a lovely picture of Anne Frank and a blue background. Now, my talk to you this evening is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be really about Anne Frank's background, her family background, where she came from, and a lot about her life growing up in Amsterdam. So people say to me that, of course, they know Anne Frank, they know all about Anne Frank and why she went into hiding and writing a diary and everything. Do they really need to listen to me speaking more about her? But when they've heard my talk, I get so much response that I've really brought Anne to life, and there is so much that they didn't know about the story. So I think you're going to find at the end of the evening, you'll know a lot more than you thought you ever did about Anne Frank. The second part of my talk, and I hope you've got your suitcases packed, because I'm going to take you off on a whistle-stop tour of the world, and we're going to see how Anne Frank has impacted on young people in some really very surprising places. And that's why I use the term surprising when I talk about her legacy. So without any further ado, let's get going. And the first slide I'm going to show you is photographs of her father, Otto Frank. And I always say when I'm giving this talk that this man is the reason I'm actually sitting in front of you this evening. I normally say that when I'm on stage, but now of course I'm sitting at my own home, but nonetheless, he is the reason that I'm here with you this evening. Now, on the left-hand picture, you see Otto as a younger man with his two beloved daughters, Margot on the left and Anne on the right. And of course, the photograph on the right is Otto as a much older man after the war. He actually lived to be 91 years old. He died in 1980. I was really sorry that I didn't get involved until 1988 with the Anne Frank work, and I never had the opportunity to meet him. But I can truly say that this man has had an enormous influence on my life. Now, Otto Frank was born in 1889 in Frankfurt in Germany. About 100 years after the Frank family had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto. And by the time Otto and his siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, were born, his father, Michael Frank, was so assimilated into Frankfurt society that Mr. Frank's father didn't just work in a bank, he actually owned a bank, the Michael Frank Investment Bank. Now, Otto, as a young man in the early years of the 20th century, went off to Heidelberg University to study business. And there he met and befriended a young American man called Nathan Strauss Jr., in fact. You can see Otto on the left there looking rather dapper in his high collar, and Nathan Strauss on the right. And Nathan invited his new friend Otto to come sail across to America and do some work experience for his father's company. Now, Nathan's father happened to own a rather large and important department store in New York. And I think you can probably just about read the name of the store on the doorway. I actually took this photograph myself. I do, well, in normal times, I spend quite a bit of time in New York because I help and advise the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect, which is based in New York. But I always pay a trip to Macy's when I'm visiting. And I took this photograph myself because this is actually the very doorway that Otto would have gone in every day when he was working as a young intern for the company. And so I find it very poignant to actually go into Macy's and actually buy something. I'm usually wearing something that I bought in Macy's. I am tonight, actually, and go through that very doorway, that historic doorway where Otto would have walked into the company. Now, Otto actually fell in love with New York. He loved America. He loved the brashness of the city and new skyscrapers. He was a promise of hope and excitement for the future. And actually, he probably would have stayed in America and become an American citizen had not in 1909, not long after he first went there, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly. And so Otto was called back to Frankfurt to go and help run the family bank. Now, Otto wasn't a born banker. It wasn't something that he enjoyed or came naturally to him, but he was more a successful small businessman. But nonetheless, he really felt his duty, it was his family duty to go and run the family bank. But 5 years later, dramatically, he was called up to fight in the First World War. He fought as a very patriotic German soldier. And so he fought so courageously for Germany that by the end of the war, he had been promoted to the rank of lieutenant and had received the Iron Cross for valor, which of course didn't help him some 20 years later. Now, after the war, with the economic situation in Germany, the bank was really on its last knees. So Otto was actually dabbling in small business. But in 1925, he attended the engagement party of a friend, and there he met a young German woman called Edith Hollander, whose family, as you can probably guess from her surname, had emigrated from the Netherlands to Germany. Even though the Frank family had really lost much of their wealth, they still were very highly respected and regarded in German society. The bank had been very successful. The Kaiser Wilhelm, had even been one of their customers. So the Frank family had a great reputation in Germany. So even though they weren't so wealthy anymore, and he was marrying the daughter of a very wealthy industrialist, nonetheless, he was welcomed into the Hollander family. So they had a lovely society wedding, and they went off to San Remo in Italy for their honeymoon. Now, the following year, on the 16th of February, 1926, their first daughter, Margot Betty, was born, followed 3 years later by their second daughter, Anneliese Marie. And she was born on the 12th of June, 1929. Now, her name was soon shortened to Anne, as we know her, but they would have pronounced it in the continental fashion of Anna. So in the photo on the left, you see Margot, beautiful dark-haired, dark-eyed girl. And on the right, there's little Anne, sleeping so peacefully in her little bed. She's probably about 3 years old when this photograph was taken. And I find it very poignant because she's so innocent and oblivious to what life is going to throw at her. Now, this photograph was taken in March 1933 on a family outing to the city centre in Frankfurt. You can see Margot on the right looking quite stoically towards her father's camera. But little Anne, she's probably had a few too many photographs taken of her on that day, and she's getting a little bit frustrated and pouting a bit at the camera. Life had changed for the Frank family very dramatically by the time this photograph was taken, because on January the 30th, just a few weeks earlier, Adolf Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany. On the 5th of March, the Nazi Party win the federal election. And pretty soon after that, democracy is dismantled. And anybody who resists and opposes the new regime is taken away to a concentration camp. It doesn't take long for the Nazi Party to start implementing measures against Germany's Jewish population. Now, it comes in so fast that by the end of the summer of 1933, Otto Frank realizes that there is no future for him and his family in the country that the Frank family have lived in so successfully for generations. So he starts making plans to move his family. Ideally, he'd love to emigrate to America, but even with the influential Strauss family in New York, they cannot get visas for America. So they start looking at Amsterdam. Now, there are several reasons for this. First of all, the Netherlands was impartial in World War I. So Mr. and Mrs. Frank probably thought that if ever war broke out, the Netherlands would remain a neutral country. Excuse me. Otto knew the city of Amsterdam because he'd done some business there. But more pragmatically, his brother-in-law living in Switzerland worked for a German company called Opekta. And Opekta was looking for a representative to open an office in Amsterdam for them. Opekta manufactured a product called pectin. Now, when I give this talk to kids in high school and I ask them if they know what pectin is, I get a lot of blank looks and a shaking of the head. But when I give it to an older demographic and I ask them if they know what pectin is, invariably they do, because it's a natural setting agent for jams and preserves and jellies. And making preserves using the fruit from the summer was very popular in 1930s Europe. So this would be a very popular product and something very easy to sell. A little bit later on, when he'd opened the office, he expanded and he went into business with another German Jewish refugee called Herman van Pels. And Herman van Pels had contacts in the butcher trade. His family were butchers. And he started importing spices for sausages. And again, another very popular product in Germany in 1930s. They would make their own sausages. So here was a real business opportunity. Mr. Frank went on ahead of his family to set up the business and find somewhere for them to live. And he found an apartment in a new development called the Mavederplein. Now, at the time in the early 1930s, this was a very modern development of apartments. And it was very popular with the German and Austrian Jewish refugees who'd fled to Amsterdam. Probably what attracted Mr. Frank to this development was the nearest thing to a New York skyscraper. You can see the tall building at the end of the development. In the middle, there was like a triangular area of grass where all the children of the families would go and play and get to know each other. So Mr. Frank finds the apartment to rent. Edith, his wife, and the older daughter Margot arrive in Amsterdam in December 1933. And a couple of months later, Anne is brought to join them, brought by her grandmother. Now, if I can just mention the little statue that's been put up there, of course, that wasn't there at the time that they lived there, because who would have known who Anne Frank was? It was put up about 5 years ago by the owner of the local bookstore around the corner. A little bit more about that bookstore a bit later on. If you go and visit Amsterdam and you want to go and visit that area where Anne grew up before she went into hiding, you can actually go and visit the Mavederplein, and you'll see a plaque on the wall of apartment number 37 where the Frank family lived. Anne started school when she was 4 years old to the local school round the corner. It was the Montessori School. Now, Montessori education was very popular with the German Jewish refugees. They seemed to like the balance of learning and structure and formality, but it was balanced with creativity and informality, which gave them a really sound education. If you look very carefully at this photograph, you'll see Anne in the middle. She's got a ring round her. Now that school is still a school. It's round the corner if you go and visit that area. And it's now known as the Anne Frank School. And the graffiti on the wall wasn't put there by a naughty child. It was actually done on purpose because it copies the writing from Anne's diary. Now, Anne was a very gregarious, outgoing little girl. She loved her friends, and she loved making new friends all the time. She seemed to have more and more friends. And there she is in the photo on the left. She's on the right-hand side, playing in the street with her little friend, Susanna Lederman. And then you can see her in the right-hand picture on the right-hand side, and Susanna's in the middle. I don't know who the girl on the left is. And when I give this talk to kids in elementary and middle schools, I always point out that many of the toys that these girls were playing with in the 1930s are very similar to the toys that are still popular today. So there's little Susanna playing with a hoop, although you're more likely to see a hoop in a gym. And little scooter, I mean, my little grandson has just taken delivery of his first scooter, which looks remarkably the same. And of course, the dolls are similar. Now, people say to me, why are there so many photographs of Anne and Margot Frank growing up? There certainly is an enormous resource of photographs. We're very lucky in this respect. And of course, these feed into the Anne Frank house displays if you go to Amsterdam, and also the exhibits, the traveling exhibits, and any book that you'll read about Anne. Mr. Frank seemed to take far more photographs of his kids than my father even took in the 1950s in his, little Kodak box Brownie. But the reason is this: Mr. Frank had a beautiful camera. He bought himself a Leica in the 1920s, and his twin passions were actually photography and his two daughters. If you look carefully in the photo on the right, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can actually just see the shadow of Mr. Frank taking the photo. Another question I'm asked is, how come these photos survived after the family went into hiding? Well, what happened was, when they realized they were going to go into hiding, they actually sent a huge box of the photographs to their family in Switzerland. And so Mr. Frank was able to retrieve this collection of photographs after the war. Now, they had a really good life in Amsterdam. In the summer, the family would take a train from the city out to the coast to the very popular resort of Zandvoort. And you can see the two girls in this lovely photograph staring out to sea. Again, I find this very poignant because they could be talking about what life will hold for them in the future. It's a very beautiful photograph. And there's Anne dressed ready to jump in the sea. In the winter, of course, they would enjoy skating on the canals when they were frozen over. And even in the summer, they would go and visit their family in Switzerland and go on vacation into the mountains. Margot, particularly, she was a very active girl, but she was also very sporty. And so she belonged to a rowing club, to a tennis club, and of course, until all that had to stop a little bit later on. Now, this photograph was taken on Anne's 10th birthday on the 12th of June, 1939. Of course, it wasn't coloured at the time. Mr. Frank didn't colour photographs, but I found it on the internet, and I think it's lovely to see these girls come to life in their beautiful coloured party dresses. Now you'll see Anne, second from the left, in a bright green dress. On the far left is her friend Jacqueline van Marsen, and she's still alive. She actually lives in Amsterdam. She's a direct contemporary of Anne's, which will make her 92 years old this year. And I've had the privilege of meeting her several times. Next to Anne, on the other side, on the right of her, is the little friend you'll recognize from the previous photos in the street, and that is Susanna Lederman. Now, tragically, Susanna and her family were arrested and deported to Auschwitz, and Susanna was gassed on arrival. The slightly taller girl next to Susanna is Anne's other friend, Hannah Pick-Goslar, who's still alive and lives in Jerusalem. And again, I've met her several times when she's come to London. And she's mentioned quite a bit in Anne's diary, and she was actually one of the very last people to see Anne alive in Bergen Belsen. The 5 girls on the right are all Anne's non-Jewish friends, because she had a very wide circle of friends. And interestingly, the tall girl in the center of the photo, by the time this picture was taken, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after this lovely photo was taken, the unthinkable happens. And on the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans bomb the Dutch port of Rotterdam. After 5 days, the Dutch capitulate because this whole city is completely flattened by this intensive bombing. If you visit Rotterdam today, you'll see a very different feel to the city than, say, Amsterdam, which has this wonderful historic whole center of the city. Rotterdam is essentially a modern city now because it was completely rebuilt after the war, because there was very little of it remaining. Interestingly, I gave a talk last night to a university in Georgia, and there was a man who was listening who actually said that he was 6 years old, living on the outskirts of Rotterdam in the bombing. And the 10th of May was actually his 6th birthday. And he described being a witness to the bombing of Rotterdam, which is something I'd never heard before. So that was very exciting to hear. The Dutch government and the royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, they go into exile, they flee to London, and then Germany invades the Netherlands. Now, for the first few months, things are pretty calm, but after around October, the new Nazi occupiers start bringing in measures again against the Jews. So by 1941, the following year, Anne and Margot have to leave their school and attend a Jewish-only school. Mr. Frank has to hand his business over to his non-Jewish employees. Jews are not allowed to own businesses. Now, fortunately, he had very trusted employees. His senior managers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, were very loyal to Mr. Frank. So in name only, the business was handed over, but Mr. Frank actually kept a benign eye on the business. Now, when she's writing in her diary a couple of years later, Anne describes what it's like as the measures were coming in against the Jews. And she writes, after May 1940, good times were few and far between. First the capitulation, then the arrival of the Germans, which is when trouble really started for us Jews. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. We were required to wear the yellow star, to turn in our bicycles. We were forbidden to ride on trams, to go to theatres, cinemas, or other forms of entertainment. We couldn't do this and we couldn't do that, but life went on. Now, in February 1942, the German occupiers issue a decree that young Jews aged between 16 and 40 are required to report to be deported to work camps in Germany. Now, very few of those young people that ever actually reported and were sent to the work camps ever came back. Margot, the older daughter, turned 16 in February 1942. So Mr. and Mrs. Frank are desperate what to do. They don't want Margot to be sent to one of these camps. Now, in the picture here, you will see Mr. Frank's office building in the Prinsengracht, which is gracht, but the word gracht means canal. So it's actually located on the Prince's Canal, the Prinsengracht, right bang in the center of Amsterdam. So the building where Mr. Frank's business, his warehouse and his offices is highlighted in blue. And Victor Kugler, one of his trusted managers, actually mentioned that there was a set of rooms at the back and top of the building. And if you look at the building, you'll see the gabled roof. That's where the rooms were that would be the hiding place. And set back from the street. And even the staff didn't really know about these rooms, that they were there. So they decided that this would be an ideal place if Margot actually received a call-up notice for them to flee immediately into hiding. There's the front of the building. As you can see, it's a very tall and narrow building, a typical 17th century Dutch merchant's building on the canal. Mr. Frank, Mr. Kugler and Mr. Kleiman set about creating the hiding place by bringing furniture and belongings into the building at night when all the staff have gone home. And this was quite a feat because these buildings are very long, high, tall and narrow with very steep steps. And if you walk around Amsterdam, you look at the top of these buildings, you'll see that there are hooks on all these buildings because that's how they hoisted furniture and large items up to the upper floors, because it was very hard to get up these steep steps. But of course they couldn't do that because they didn't want to arouse suspicion. They had to wait until nighttime when the workers had gone home to bring all the stuff in. And Victor Kugler hits on an idea, because there's a door, of course, leading to this secret hiding place, that if they could build a bookcase and fill it with office paraphernalia like files and folders, once they'd gone into hiding behind that door, they could close the bookcase against the door and no one would even suspect there was a door there. And this is what they did. So a bookcase was built. And when you go and visit the Anne Frank house, if you haven't done so already, you will still go into the secret hiding place behind that very same bookcase that the Franks went into hiding. Now, on the 12th of June, 1942, Anne marks her 13th birthday. And just a few days before her birthday, she's walking in the area around the Moveda Plain where they live, and spots in the window of the local bookstore. I mentioned the bookstore a little bit earlier on too with regard to the statue. This is what she sees. This, of course, isn't the original, it's a facsimile. And she spots this in the window, and probably what attracted her to this little notebook was this little brass lock, because what 13-year-old girl that's going to write some intimate secrets into her notebook doesn't want a lock to keep prying eyes away? So she drops a few hints to her dad that this is something she'd really like for her birthday. And he goes back and he buys it, and it's wrapped, and Mr. and Mrs. Frank present this lovely little red check notebook to Anne on her 13th birthday. And she starts writing in that notebook straight away. She writes about her friends, her school. She goes around the class in school and she writes about everybody. And to be honest, she's not very flattering about them. She writes about her boyfriends. She's actually running 2 boyfriends at the time, both of whom can't keep their eyes off her. And she just writes generally about her life. And she's really enthusiastic about this. And she decides it's going to be her most intimate confidant, which is quite surprising because she's got a lot of close friends. And after about a week or so of writing, she decides to give her diary a name, and she calls it Kitty, after a character in one of her favourite novels. Now, on the 5th of July, a Sunday, the doorbell rings on the Frank family's apartment, And standing there is the postman with the dreaded call-up notice for Margot. Margot has to report at midnight to be transported to Germany. There's no time to lose, and the Frank family the very next day pack their belongings and in a bag, a small bag, wearing layers and layers of clothing because they don't want to carry suitcases across town because that would arouse suspicions. They walk across town in the pouring rain and very early in the morning, so the staff aren't already there, and they go into the offices, up the stairs, behind the bookcase, and go into hiding. Now, this is Anne and Margot's bedroom in hiding. And as a surprise for Anne, Mr. Frank has brought a collection of her photographs of famous movie stars, which she absolutely loved, and they adorn her wall. They are still there if you visit the Anne Frank house. She also loved royal families. And if you look at this photo, at the bottom left, you'll see two little photos, one above the other. Now, those are photographs of Princess Elizabeth, our current queen, and her younger sister, Princess Margaret. And a few years ago, I was actually taking the Queen's youngest son, the Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward, around the Anne Frank exhibition. And there was a photograph of Anne's bedroom wall with all these photos on. And I said to him, is there anyone you recognise here, sir, on Anne's bedroom wall? And he sort of looked and he looked. He went, oh, there's my mother. So it was rather funny, actually. There was his mother as a little girl on Anne's bedroom wall. Now, a week after the Frank family disappear into hiding, they're joined by another family, Mr. Frank's business associate, Mr. Van Pels. If you recall, I told you he was the one who was importing the spices for the sausages. And so Mr. and Mrs. Van Pels and their 16-year-old son, Petter. Now, at first, Petter being the same age as Margot, the two of them formed a unit, a close unit, because they were the same age. And Anne was a little bit disdainful. She found them rather tedious and boring. And then a little bit later on, in December of that year, they were joined by a local dentist called Fritz Pfeffer, and also a German Jew fleeing for his life. And at that stage, Anne and Margot had to split up rooms. Margot went to stay with her parents in their room because there simply wasn't enough space for 8 people. So Anne was forced to share her bedroom with Mr. Pfeffer. Now, she found this incredibly annoying because he was a strict disciplinarian and Anne was rather a feisty girl that didn't actually naturally listen to what adults said. He was also, she found him very stuffy. She also was forced to share the little writing desk in the room with him. He was writing love letters to his beloved fiancée, non-Jewish woman who wasn't in hiding. And Anne, of course, was writing her beloved diary, which, of course, she'd taken into hiding with her. And so there was a lot of tension between Anne and Mr. Pfeffer, and she writes quite critically about him in her diary. She describes this buffoon of a man. She even gives him the name Mr. Dussel, which means Mr. Stupid. But in fact, Fritz Pfeffer was a very handsome, very athletic man who was desperately missing his family. And while she was in hiding, her diary became such a comfort to her. She was isolated from her friends who were so important. She couldn't go to school. She wrote about what went on every day in the secret annex, the annoying things that the adults were doing that were driving her mad, and the fears about what was happening on the outside world and what would happen to them if they were ever found. As she grew a little bit older, she wrote very much about her dreams and ambitions of what she would do when she grew up. She imagined her future life and her ambition to be a writer. In fact, she didn't only write in her diary, she also wrote fictional stories. She let her imagination fly out of the window. And very poignant because in some of these stories, she wrote about herself as an adult, or as a 16-year-old. And of course, she didn't live even to be 16. But writing became a great comfort to her. And she actually wrote, "When I write, I can shake off all my cares. My sorrow disappears. My spirits are revived." By 1944, little Anne is transitioning from a girl, a child, into an adolescence and all that comes with it. So the changes in her body, her emotions, her feelings of sexuality. And of course, she's away from boys. So all this is actually being directed at young Peter van Pels. And so she starts getting these romantic feelings for Peter, who previously she'd found rather boring and tedious. And Peter and Anne take the opportunity to go up above the hiding place. There's a dusty, dirty old attic that they can climb up a ladder to get to. And they spend quite a bit of time alone up there, talking, sharing their concerns about the future, moaning about the adults, and generally having these romantic feelings of a teenage romance. And she writes so vividly about these feelings. She even enjoys her first kiss up in that dusty old attic with Peter. But after a while, she starts getting a bit bored with him. She finds him a little bit immature, not quite intellectually up to her standard. And anyway, by April 1944, she's discovered a new passion. The Dutch education minister in exile in London broadcasts on the BBC that the Dutch under Nazi occupation should be keeping journals and diaries that could be published after the war, describing their lives under the occupation. Anne's got a new passion, so she starts editing her diary with a view to it being published. So from April 1944, she's editing 2 years of writing in this diary. And of course, the little Czech notebook very soon gets used up. So she's writing in exercise books and loose leaf pieces of paper. And then simultaneously, she's continuing to write the diary. So she is determined that this is going to be published. Another thing that became very important to Anne in hiding was nature, and she freely admits that she never really appreciated nature before she was taken away from it in hiding. She writes a lot about nature in her diary, and her only glimpse of the outside world was a little window at the top of the attic where she and Peter used to go. She could see the top of the chestnut tree in the garden, and she could see the seasons changing through that glimpse of the chestnut tree. And Anne writes, "It's not my imagination. Looking at the sky, the clouds, the moon and the stars really does make me feel calm and hopeful." Now, I can't talk about 8 people in hiding without talking about the helpers, because these are the people that risk their lives every single day, not just for a week or a month, even for 1 year, but for over 2 years, to keep the 8 people in hiding fed and nourished and supplying them with information and medication when needed. Now, this is a picture of Mr. Frank after the war when he went back into the business with these trusted employees that risked their lives to help those 8 people. Imagine these people were actually living under German occupation, and they had severe rationing themselves. So it was difficult enough for them to find enough food to feed their own families, let alone 8 people. So here we have on the left, the bottom left next to Mr. Frank is Miep Gies, probably the most famous of the helpers. On the right is Bet Voskil, who was a young secretary, and it was actually her father, who was a carpenter, who built the bookcase. And Miep was actually more Margot Frank's age. She was still a teenager when she was doing this. And at the back, you've got Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, the 2 very trusted managers. I spent a lot of time with Miep in the 1990s and the early 2000s when I'd started the trust. She actually lived to be an incredible age. She lived to be 100 and died in 2010. And really one of the most unforgettable days of my life was going to the Academy Awards in Hollywood and walking down that red carpet with Miep, because a documentary that I commissioned called Anne Frank Remembered, which was absolutely marvelous, and it was part of the BBC's programming for the 50th anniversary of the liberation from Europe, the end of the war, and it was nominated for an Oscar. So Miep, who features so much in the film, she's a real star of the film, and myself accompanied the director, John Blair, to Hollywood, and it was quite phenomenal. It won. It was the first British documentary to win for 25 years. And John took a little white-haired elderly lady up onto the stage with him to receive the Oscar. And you can imagine people were looking rather bemused because they're used to all these very glamorous Hollywood actresses going up on the stage. And John said to the audience of 1 billion people watching around the world, ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one. And you can imagine the whole auditorium just erupted and stood on their feet when they realized this is the woman who had helped Anne Frank. 6th of June 1944, it's D-Day. British, American and Canadian troops arrive on the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe from the Nazis. Anne writes so excitedly about D-Day. D-Day, this is the day. And she writes that friends are on their way and maybe soon she can go back to school. So you can imagine after D-Day, hopes were really high that they would soon be liberated and be able to get on with their lives. The 4th of August 1944 is a warm and sunny day in Amsterdam. At 10 o'clock in the morning, someone, and we will never know who, makes a call to the Gestapo offices and reports that there are Jews hiding in 263 Prinsengracht. Around 10:30, a Gestapo officer, Karl Josef Silberbar, accompanied by 2 Dutch policemen, go upstairs into the offices of Mr. Frank's company, pointing pistols at Mr. Kleiman and Mr. Kugler and Miep. They have a look around and they point to the bookcase and ask for it to be opened. They head upstairs, pointing their pistols, and there they find the 8 petrified Jews. The 8 people are taken away, first to the Gestapo headquarters in the south of the city, where they're interrogated for 2 full days. They are then put on the train to Westerbork transit camp in the north of the Netherlands. On the 3rd of September, 1944, all 8 Jews are deported by cattle truck, cars and a train from the Netherlands to Auschwitz camp in Poland. Now, tragically, had the families been arrested perhaps 1 month later, they wouldn't be on that train because it was the very last transport taking Jews out of the Netherlands to Poland, to Westerbork, to Auschwitz. They arrived there after 3 agonizing days in these cattle trucks on the 6th of September, and the men are then separated from the women. They never see their families again. In late October, Anne and Margot are separated from their mother, their desperate mother, Edith, who is left behind in Auschwitz. Anne and Margot are taken by transport to Bergen Belsen camp in the north of Germany. Now, Bergen Belsen camp, by that time, is very neglected. The Germans knew that the Allies were coming, and the poor inmates of that camp had a most terrible time. There was very little food, very, very little food, and I've met many survivors of Bergen Belsen who've actually said to me, I don't even remember seeing food. the water was contaminated, and there were waves of the deadly disease of typhus flying through the camps. Now, sometime in February or March 1945, Margot, and then a day or so later, Anne, just gave up the fight for life. They truly believed that they were orphans. They could, for example, their father was a middle-aged man. He was about 56 by that time. He'd been born, remember, in 1889. And they couldn't believe that their father would survive the privations of Auschwitz. In actual fact, Mr. Frank, by the time those two girls lay dying, he'd actually been liberated from Auschwitz because it was liberated by the Russians on the 27th of January. And he was already on the route back to Amsterdam. Their mother, Edith, had actually died on the 6th of January from starvation and despair and disease, just 3 weeks before the Russians liberated Auschwitz. So these little girls, they just couldn't hang on any longer. They died around 3 weeks before Bergen Belsen was liberated by the British. Their little emaciated bodies were thrown into a mass pit. Of course, there was no gravestone. They were thrown into a pit with thousands of others. The gravestone was put up a few years ago by their cousin, Buddy Elias, who lived in Switzerland. He was a great friend of mine. I was very privileged to have known him. Sadly, he died a few years ago. Mr. Frank has a tortuous journey back to Amsterdam, because remember, when he was liberated from Poland, Western Europe was still at war. He arrives back in Amsterdam in June, 5 months after his liberation from Auschwitz. The Netherlands had actually been liberated on the 5th of May. And when I gave my talk yesterday, we were actually marking Dutch Liberation Day. He has nowhere to go and live. The apartment on the Maveda plain has been requisitioned as soon as they went into hiding and given to a Nazi sympathizing Dutch family. So he goes to live with Miep, and her husband Jan, also a very courageous man. He was in the Dutch resistance, and begins a search for any news of his two daughters. At first, he puts an advert in the local newspaper for news of the girls. And then two sisters come forward. He goes to meet them, and they say that they were with Anne and Margot as the girls lay dying. And then he receives a telegram from the Red Cross one day when he's working in his office. He comes out of his office and he goes to see Miep, who's sitting at her desk. And he says, Miep, the girls are no more. And with that, Miep goes to the drawer of her desk and she pulls out the little red check diary. And she says to him, there you are, Mr. Frank. There is the legacy of your daughter. He goes away and reads Anne's diary, and he realizes he'd never known the hidden depths of his teenage, feisty, precocious daughter who had an answer for everything. Because in her later entries, Anne wrote very powerfully about responsibility for the world and how she was going to make the world better as an adult. Now, the reason that Miep had that little diary in her desk was because after the families had been taken away, she very bravely went upstairs to the hiding place and broke the lock that the arresting officers had put on the door. And she went to gather up anything that she could collect to give the Frank family back. Because remember, by now, the Allies are advancing. It's late in the war, and she feels that the Frank family will return and she'll be able to give Anne's diary back to her. All the valuables had already been taken away by the arresting officers, but she did find on the floor Anne's diary and all her writing. So she kept it in the drawer for the day that she would be able to give it back to Anne personally. Now, Mr. Frank has a dilemma, what to do with this diary. It's very profound, and he knows that Anne's greatest wish was to have been a published writer. But she doesn't write very kindly about the adults who were in hiding together and tragically all lost their lives. So he consults a few friends, what's he going to do, including a literary critic friend called Jan Romain. And Jan Romain writes an article that's published on the front of the local newspaper called Het Parool. And in it he says, everybody should read this little girl's voice. And on the strength of that article, a publishing company comes forward called Contact. They're a small Roman Catholic company that agreed to publish Anne's diary in a limited edition of 1,500 copies because they're not sure anyone's going to want to read about wartime experiences because the Netherlands had suffered so badly during the occupation. They're ready to move forward and forget the privations of the war. So on the 25th of June 1947, Anne's diary is finally published under the title Het Achterhuis, the back house. By December of that year, it's in a second edition. By February the following year, it's in a third edition. And it starts taking off around the world. Now, it's remarkable because in one of her first entries, Anne wrote, "Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on, neither I nor anyone else would be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl." Not interested? Well, to date, Anne Frank's diary has sold more than 30 million copies. I used to say it was the second most widely read book in the English language after the Bible, but actually that was before Harry Potter came along. It's been translated into more than 70 languages. I was actually walking through Bangkok airport in Thailand several years ago, and I actually saw a copy in the Thai language in the airport bookstore. And new dramatic and musical interpretations, documentaries and books about Anne's life are continuing to be created. And a travelling exhibition about her life has been seen by over 9 million people around the world. It was John F. Kennedy who in 1960 said, "Of the multitude who throughout history have spoken for human dignity in times of great suffering and loss, none is more compelling than that of Anne Frank." Another person who was greatly moved by Anne's diary was this lovely lady in the middle of the photo. Excuse me. You might recognize her. Of course, it's Audrey Hepburn. And there she is with Mr. Frank and his second wife, Fritzi. He remarried a Holocaust survivor in 1953, a very successful marriage. And they went to visit Audrey to prevail upon her to play Anne in the George Stevens movie in 1959. And Audrey, I met her in London in 1991, and she became a patron of the Anne Frank Trust. I was very proud of getting her. And she told me and Otto Frank's stepdaughter, Eva Schloss, Fritz's daughter, why she refused to play Anne in the movie. And she said, reading Anne's diary just broke her heart because she spent the war in the Netherlands. She was Dutch, and she was actually helping the Dutch resistance. She was carrying messages in her shoes. And it really just broke her to hear Anne's testimony because she identified so closely with Anne. They were the same age, although of course she wasn't a victim of the Holocaust. And it was quite remarkable that we were able to meet her just 18 months before she died, actually. And I'll never forget that wonderful meeting. Now, during the 1950s, a phenomenon starts happening. The diary is taking off around the world. It's being published in many different countries. And Otto Frank starts receiving letters from teenagers all over the world. Now, the reason is that Otto was given a very good press in Anne's diary, unlike all the other adults. Anne loved her father and she really respected and admired him. He was a very liberal-minded person, particularly for that era. Remember, he was born in 1889. But probably because he spent time in New York, he had a much more worldly, liberal view. And so these teenagers who in those days didn't feel that they can confide in their parents or their teachers because they simply weren't taken seriously, would write letters to Mr. Frank. And you know, every single letter that he received, he answered, and he wasn't typing on a word processor, he was typing on a typewriter. He was ably helped by his wife Fritzi, and the pair of them devoted the second half of their lives to promoting Anne's diary as a force for good. And a couple of years ago, I was giving a lecture in New York, and a woman came up to me after my lecture and she said, "I've got something to show you." And she produced 2 letters that she had received as a teenager in the 1970s from Mr. Frank, because she wrote to him and he wrote back. And being a very well brought up young lady, she wrote back to thank him for his letter, and he wrote back to her again. So it was wonderful to see those original letters that we'd heard so much about. Now, by 1960, the whole area around the hiding place in the Prinsengracht is becoming derelict. And in those days, there wasn't this feeling of heritage and we must preserve these wonderful 400 years old buildings. No, they were going to knock them down. And but people were already starting to come on pilgrimage to look across the canal and see the building where Anne had been in hiding. So Mr. Frank, with a group of friends, actually went to see the mayor of Amsterdam and said, if we can raise some money, could we preserve this building as not as a memorial, not as a backward-looking memorial, but as an education centre and museum that people can come and visit. And so on the 10th of May, 1960, the doors of the secret hiding place were open to the public. And there you see Mr. Frank in that dusty, dirty old attic where Anne and Peter used to go to be together alone. You can only imagine what that poor man is thinking. And believe it or not, those first early days when you would go and visit the Anne Frank house, you used to have to ring the doorbell and wait for someone to come and let you in. Very different actually from nowadays, because by the mid-1980s, the numbers are really growing of tourists coming to visit the Anne Frank house and wait patiently in line. Now, this photograph was actually taken quite recently, before the pandemic, of course, but even a few years ago, the booking system of getting into the Anne Frank house changed quite radically. You won't find these very long lines of people waiting to get in, waiting for an hour, sometimes 2 hours in the summer. Just a little tip, if you are planning to visit the Anne Frank house, you must book your tickets online about 6 weeks before your visit. Earlier than that, the tickets won't be released yet. If you leave it too late, then you won't get a ticket. So you don't see these long lines of people anymore. But one day, one of the staff of the Anne Frank house was looking out of the window and he looked at the line of people and he struck on an idea. And he went to see the director, Hans Westra, and he said, what if we create a mobile Anne Frank house and take it out to the world? All these people that can't get across to Amsterdam. And the director liked the idea and commissioned the historians to create an exhibition. It was launched in 1985 in the Westerkerk, which is the beautiful 17th century church around the corner from the Anne Frank house, and simultaneously in New York and in Frankfurt. And it's been touring ever since. And so I hope you're ready with your suitcases packed, because I'm going to take you off on a little whistle-stop tour of the world for the last part of this talk. And you're going to see how learning about Anne Frank has impacted on young people in some very surprising places. Now, fairly recently, in about 10 years ago, the way the exhibition was presented changed quite dramatically from lots of big community exhibitions in cathedrals and museums and city halls, etc., to focusing on smaller exhibitions going into schools. And what we do, both in the UK and from the Anne Frank House, where they travel around the world, and in America, in the USA organization, we take a smaller exhibition into a school and we train the teenagers to be our peer educators. And so it's actually our docents at the exhibitions are the teenagers themselves, so especially trained, and they are teenagers telling other teenagers the story of a teenager. And it's been an incredibly successful program, both for those teenagers that are actually doing the educating and the kids that are actually receiving it from one of their peers. Now, this picture, for example, was taken in Kolkata in India. And there you see on the left, the peer educator telling the other teenagers about the story of Anne Frank. And those kids themselves made connections between Anne's experience of discrimination and the iniquities of the caste system in India, which still exists. They didn't have to be told by their teacher, they made the connections. Here we are in Japan, and these two girls are peer guides, peer educators. And it's a very interesting phenomenon in Japan because Anne's diary was published there very early on in 1952. And of course, Japan was in the opposing side of the war. Anne has been an icon for the Japanese since the publication of her diary. And they always viewed her as a symbol of the suffering of children in war, and linked her story to the suffering of children in Nagasaki and Hiroshima after the atomic bombs, which is fine, but they never actually contextualized Anne Frank's story and why she wrote her diary against the Holocaust. It's only fairly recently, since the Anne Frank exhibition has been traveling around Japan, and in fact there's a Holocaust museum now in Tokyo, that her story is contextualized against the Holocaust. She was just seen as a symbol of peace. Here we are in a prison, and the Anne Frank Trust in the UK has been taking exhibits and programs into British prisons since 2002. And again, we train the prisoners themselves to be the peer educators, the peer docents. You can see the young man there proudly wearing his Anne Frank exhibition guide t-shirt. And what we do is we have a graduation ceremony at the end of the 2 weeks that we have the exhibition there for these guides. And in fact, we give them a certificate and a book. And in many cases, these young men have not had a certificate for anything. But what we also do is we've been taking Holocaust survivors into prisons to speak to the prisoners. And it's a very profound experience for these prisoners when they see an elderly woman or man, very smartly dressed, come in front of them and tell them about their experience of prison was to be there simply to be killed. This survivor is Eva Schloss, and she's actually my co-founder of the Anne Frank Trust and is Anne Frank's posthumous stepsister, because it was her mother who married Otto Frank after the war, and Otto became her stepfather. She absolutely adored him. And she was a friend of Anne Frank's. The two families had lived together in the same apartment development, the Maveda Plain. And so she played with Anne before both families went into hiding. She wasn't a close friend because they were very different in personality. Anne was quite precocious. She was into movie stars and fashions and boyfriends, whereas Eva was a bit more of a tomboy. But nonetheless, on the journey back from Auschwitz, she recognized Mr. Frank as her friend's father and introduced him to her mother. And 7 years later, her mother and Mr. Frank married, and it was a very happy, successful marriage. So there's Eva in a prison in West London, talking to the prisoners. She's been into the same prison for 4 years running. And it's a very profound experience because when prisoners hear a Holocaust survivor speak, it really gives them a sense of perspective of their own grievances against society. And here's another prisoner. Here you'll probably recognize Mr. Mandela. And in 1994, he opened the Anne Frank exhibition that was touring South Africa. And he gave a remarkable speech in Johannesburg and described what Anne's diary had meant to him, both before he went into prison as a young lawyer when he read it, And when he was in prison for all those years in Robben Island, where Anne's diary was smuggled into the prison library, and the prisoners were encouraged by Mr. Mandela to read it as a testament to the human spirit. And that little volume of the book was read so many times that it literally fell to bits. And the prisoners, encouraged by Mr. Mandela, they copied out Anne's diary by hand at night, taking it in turns to copy parts of it out in their prison cells by candlelight, which was quite a dangerous act, so that others could continue to read Anne's diary. It's a remarkable story. And then the Anne Frank House continued to work with exhibitions in South Africa, taking exhibitions into the shanty towns around Johannesburg and Cape Town, those really impoverished shanty towns, and training these young people who had very little hope and aspiration to be exhibition peer educators. And, you know, one of the boys on the left of this photograph, I'm not quite sure which one it is, but he entered a writing competition staged by the American Embassy in South Africa. And in that writing competition, he wrote about what it meant to him to be an Anne Frank educator. And he won the competition, was flown across to Washington, DC, treated like a VIP. He came back to South Africa. He got himself educated, went to university, and is now a teacher. And he owes that all to having been chosen to be an Anne Frank peer educator when he was a kid. And here we are in Kazakhstan. I'm in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, the land of the Mongols. And you'd think, what on earth would teenagers find that they have in common with a little Jewish girl who lived in Amsterdam in Western Europe in the middle of the last century? But here you can see this young boy educating his peers about Anne Frank, and there's a panel from the exhibition behind him, and how engaged these kids are. So Anne Frank resonates with young people all over the world. We've done a lot of work in Asia, as I said earlier, in Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and young people all over the world find something in common with this teenager. In the 1990s and early 2000s, I did a lot of work in Northern Ireland. And as you may know, it's still a very divided society. Kids grow up either going to a Catholic school or a Protestant school, living in a Catholic or a Protestant area, going to Catholic or Protestant stores. And they have very little opportunity to actually meet together. And when we took the Anne Frank exhibition to Northern Ireland, both before and after the Good Friday Agreement, we ensured that the kids would come together from the Catholic and Protestant schools to learn the lessons of Anne's life. And one of my proudest moments at the Anne Frank Trust was actually when a Catholic school and a Protestant school in Armagh, right down on Bandit Country, very much in the Troubles, the kids came together to produce a cross-community newspaper called Anne's Legacy. And it was the first time they'd had the opportunity of working together. And this photo was taken in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And again, like in South Africa, the shanty town, this is a school, a community school in a favela in a very, very poor slum district around Sao Paulo. And you see these little young peer educators, they're 11 and 12 years old. You see how animated they are, telling the story of what happened to Anne Frank and Europe, about Europe after the First World War, and what led to the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust, to the man in the red tie. And he's listening very intently. It didn't seem to worry these kids at all that they were explaining the history of Europe to none other than the Dutch foreign minister, like your Secretary of State, who was on a state visit to Brazil, and he was invited to come and open the Anne Frank exhibition. I was actually there. I'd also been invited to come and speak at that opening. And it was an incredible moment to see these kids educating the Dutch foreign minister. And here we are in a very multicultural school in London. In the UK, we tend to work in either multicultural areas, very divided communities, where there are a lot of, for example, sometimes we'll go into a 100% Asian school. And also we go into monocultural communities, particularly in areas of great deprivation. You know, the former post-industrial towns, like the former mining communities, like you would call the Rust Belt communities, and where there's very little hope and aspiration for the future. But by training these young people to become Anne Frank educators themselves, we are giving them great hope and ambition. And here we are in Sri Lanka, in Jaffna. Now, Sri Lanka, that beautiful little island off the coast of India, endured a terrible 30-year-long civil war between the Tamils and the Lankans. And the city of Jaffna, a very beautiful city, was actually cut off from the rest of Sri Lanka for many, many years of that civil war. It was a very brutal war. And the Anne Frank exhibition was one of the very first projects to be allowed into Jaffna after the war had ended. And there you see kids from the Lankan and the Tamil, both sides in the conflict, listening to a young peer educator in her beautiful purple sari. And these kids were so engaged and so taken by the exhibition about the teenager Anne Frank, that they decided they were going to come together and produce their own traveling exhibition about their experiences in the war. And my final picture is a little bit nearer to home from you. This is at a school in South Carolina, and this is one of the programs done by the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect based in the USA. They operate exhibitions out of the University of South Carolina, and hopefully when things return to normal, they may well bring an exhibit to a school near you. You're very welcome to contact them if you would like an exhibit to come to your children or your grandchildren's school, or perhaps even to one of your libraries. Again, they're very immersed in peer-to-peer education and learning how to discuss topics such as tolerance and discrimination in an open forum, and also learning communication skills necessary for visual literacy and public speaking, and actually organizing the exhibitions themselves. So there you are. I've taken you on a very fast whistle-stop tour of the world. I know you're probably thinking I'm getting ready for dinner. I'm certainly getting ready for bed because it's 1:15 in the morning here. But there she is, our girl Anne Frank. In some ways, an ordinary little girl, and in some ways, an extraordinary little girl. But because she was Jewish, she was considered subhuman, Untermenschen, unworthy of the right to live by her oppressors. On the 15th of July, 1944, Anne wrote these words in her beloved diary. "It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet, when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them. Yours, Anne M. Frank." Well, just 3 weeks after she wrote those words, her family was betrayed and arrested, and she began her terrible 7-month journey to her death. But thanks to tens of thousands of educators, of human rights activists, and above all, our wonderful peer educators around the world, those ideals are being realized. And so if I can just give another little plug to my book, it's been called A Handbook of Hope. And it's one of those books where you don't have to read it from cover to cover first immediately. You can dip into the different chapters and learn more about some of the amazing people I've told you about tonight, some of those that knew Anne Frank, but also you can just dip into a chapter about a different part of the world and learn about some of their history and how they've learnt about Anne Frank and how they've moved her story forward. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward, I hope, to some questions now.
Apologies, I was muted. I was just saying thank you, Ms. Perry, so much. And I know it's quite late for you, but we do have a couple questions. One of those is the exhibition still touring? Has it ever come to Maryland or DC that you know of? And I would also ask, is it something that we might be able to find online while we're still somewhat restricted to home?
Yes, if you go onto the Anne Frank Centre for Mutual Respect website, which is very simple, it's just annefrank.com. You might want to pop it into the chat box.
I will put that in the email I send out tomorrow.
Yes, okay, that's lovely. And yes, obviously, of course, the exhibits aren't touring at the moment. They're all stored safely away at the University of South Carolina. But once things return to normal, of course, those exhibits will be going out again. They'll be back on the road, hopefully going into schools and communities and training our peer educators as well. They have got some online resources. The Anne Frank Trust in the UK, my own organisation, they've got quite a lot of online resources as well. So that's annefrank.org.uk. So yeah, but as soon as those exhibitions can get up and running again, they'll be out there. So I would try and get in as quickly as you can with the Anne Frank Centre, and they'll get an exhibit to your school or community.
Thank you. I'm going to grab that link real quick and put that in the chat for everyone. And if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we can respond to those. One question I had, I think I know the answer, because there wouldn't have been a way for Otto Frank to process and develop and print his film, you know, his passion being photography while in hiding. What were some of the ways that the other occupants of the hidden space processed and managed their feelings? Were there any other documents that came out of?
Well, you know, apparently Margot kept a diary as well, but it was obviously lost. We don't have it. I guess really it's reading Anne's diary. You will find out what they were actually going through, because it was only actually Otto, of course, of the 8 people that were in hiding, it was only Otto that actually survived. So it's his testaments as to what was actually happening on a day-to-day level. They were being educated. 3 teenagers were being educated. Mr. Frank was keeping them up with their lessons in the morning sessions, weekday morning sessions. They would have to do their lessons. Margot, who was very intellectual, very academically bright, she was taking all kinds of correspondence courses. I actually did a lecture last summer for a cultural tours company in Philadelphia, who asked me to do a series of 5 lectures on aspects of Anne's life. And one of the lectures was on the life in hiding. So it was very, you know, I drilled down very deeply as to how they would spend their days. And Margot, of course, couldn't actually apply herself for a correspondence course, but it was actually Bep, the secretary. She applied for the correspondence course, pretending it was her and bringing it in for Margot to do. So yeah, we don't have any written testimonies about what went on apart from Anne's diary, but we do have the recollections of Otto that he shared after the war.
And could you also share, again, the name of the documentary film that you mentioned?
Yes, that won the Oscar and Emmy and Oscar that year. It was called Anne Frank Remembered, directed by John Blair. And I think you can actually track it down in DVD.
Anne Frank Remembered. Thank you.
Anne Frank Remembered, yeah.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions from our friends at home tonight?
Or comments or observations?
Any observations, anything? I know it's a lot to take in. It's
Yes.
very overwhelming. It can be very,
Yeah.
very
Yes.
overwhelming. I remember visiting the Anne Frank house. I remember visiting Auschwitz and Bergen Belsen, and they are experiences that leave you stunned and very difficult to process
Yes.
many of the emotions that the topic brings up. So I
Yeah.
understand needing some time to process that. So.
Yes, and then very often people find that they're still, as you say, processing because it is a long talk. But I'm really open if you have any other questions or observations you want to send to email to Ali, respond to her email tomorrow, and she'll send them on to me. I'm quite happy to answer and just email back.
We do have one question. I think this is a good question to end on, actually. How can a student get involved?
Bring the program to their school.
Suggest I think in general, yes, with the memory
Yes.
and legacy.
Yes, yes, and once they've been trained as a peer educator, I mean, for example, in the UK, what we do with our peer educators, they then go into their elementary schools and tell the story of Anne Frank. So the ripples sort of go out. And yes, so I would suggest starting by trying to bring a program to their school.
Wonderful, thank you. One last question here. We just, now questions are coming in. Was Bep or anyone else punished for their participation in the hiding?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. They had different experiences, the helpers. Bep, when she saw the Gestapo and police arriving, she scarpered, she ran, which I don't blame her. She was only young, she was a kid. Meep, actually, it turned out that the arresting officer, Silberbauer, and Meep both hailed from Vienna. And so he gave her a good talking to and told her off for hiding Jews, but actually let her go. And that's why she was able to go up and rescue the diary. She was incredibly brave because after all that she'd done over the 2 years, she actually, when the families were arrested, she went out and raised some money from local people that they knew. Mr. Frank was very highly respected. And she went to the Gestapo headquarters to try and buy their freedom. And unfortunately, the room she went into, the German officer was listening to the BBC radio, which was a punishable offense for him. And he literally threw her out of the building. So she couldn't actually save them. So she actually was not arrested. However, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman both were arrested for their part in harboring the Jews. And Victor Kugler actually managed to escape from prison. It was sort of like the final weeks of the war. He was being transported from one prison to another, and there was a bombing raid, an Allied bombing raid, and he managed to escape and went to hide on a local farm, and then he made his way back to his own home. Johannes Kleiman was very sick by then. The stresses of 2 years of looking after 8 people in hiding really took a great toll on his health. And he was actually in hospital. He was hospitalized in the prison, and he was visited by the Red Cross, and they insisted that he was released. So the 2 managers were both arrested.
Wow. And let's just close with this. This is a good question to close with. What inspired you to learn and support Anne's legacy, and how did you get started? This whole process that has changed.
Well, that's another lecture in itself, okay. Actually. But it was pure chance, actually. It was the mid-1980s. The exhibition had just come to the UK a couple of years earlier, and I got a call from my great friend and rabbi, David Suttendorp, out of the blue one day. I was one of these people that always got involved and active in things. And he said, I've heard about this traveling exhibition that's just come to England from the Netherlands. And my father and Otto Frank were very good friends. And I just wonder if you could help me bring it to our town. Our town was on the south coast of England. And I said, oh, I'd love to do that. That sounds really interesting. So we brought the exhibit to the university campus on the outskirts of town. In 3 weeks, we had 10,000 visitors. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is just such an amazing project. So that fall, I put myself on a plane to Amsterdam to meet with the director of the Anne Frank House to convince him that they needed a British representative to keep this exhibition on the road. And for my sins, I was appointed the British representative of the Anne Frank House. For some reason, they trusted me. And then the following year, I set up the Anne Frank Trust as a British charity. And with Eva, Otto's stepdaughter, and David, who was the original person who made the call, and another friend of Otto Frank's. It was all run from my home, from my desk originally. And then we moved to London to offices, and the rest is history. When I left the trust, when I retired 5 years ago as its executive director after 26 years, the trust had 35 members of staff taking the exhibits all over the country. So it's been a great source of pride growing that organization. But 5 years ago, I decided I wanted to do something different rather than look after 35 members of staff. And so I wrote the book, and someone had to write this incredible chronicle of this amazing work being done around the world. And now I lecture and sometimes travel around on cruise ships.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been a truly fantastic evening. I appreciate you staying up so late to join us from across the pond. And thank you all to our friends and neighbors who dialed in tonight to join us and learn with us. I will be following up with an email tomorrow, and I'll share my email address as well so that people can share any further questions they might have. I can pass those on to you.
And do recommend me, because a lot of my my lectures come from word of mouth. So if there's a community organization or another library or a school, I'm always happy to do it. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, get some rest, and thank you again to all our friends at home. Have a great evening,
Thank you, everyone.